Thank you for tuning in to EcoJustice Radio and our show, To Be Determined. I am your host, Jessica Aldridge, and it is my honor to welcome our guest, Margaret Elysia Garcia, author and poet published by El Martillo Press. Welcome to EcoJustice Radio.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome, Margaret. You, like I said in the intro, you are a poet. You lived in the northern Sierra Nevada town of Greenville, California, a town that dates back to California's gold rush era. And for our listeners, Greenville is about 2 hours north of Lake Tahoe or Reno, Nevada. But then on July 13th, 2021, there was this fire, the Dixie Fire, a huge, devastating fire, and that was not contained until October 25th. In its wrath, it decimated much of the small community of Greenville, where you live. As a poet, you have taken your experience and that of the community and put pen to paper. Today, I want to hear about your experience and have you share your poetry with us. So before we jump in, briefly explain, because there's so much to share and so much beautiful poetry that our listeners get to enjoy. Briefly explain why you use poetry to raise awareness and environmental consciousness.
Yeah, well, a couple of things come to mind. I always wrote poetry first, and poetry always seemed the most personal. I do a lot of article writing and fiction, but poetry to me has always been my kind of immediate home base. And I didn't feel like creating characters or anything. I wanted this to be, I wanted the chapbook Burn Scars to be really immediate. And also, I really wanted to raise awareness because the news coverage, and I was a reporter at the time in the area, the news coverage from outside of the area was so horrible that I really wanted us to like grab some control of our own narrative as it was being disseminated out much differently than we thought it was going to be. And now, of course, I'm working on Watershed manuscript, which kind of refines a lot of the burn scar poems and kind of moves past what we're all going through now 2 years later as people are trying to rebuild and coming up against roadblocks for that.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that rebuild and what's happening and the roadblocks that they have met. Set the stage for us. Tell us about the town of Greenville prior to the fire in 2021. What was the demographics? What was the population? Why was it considered an historic town?
So it does date back to the gold rush, but I don't think any of us actually thought of it as a historic town. It was not the county seat, and so it only had about 1,200 people, and more like 900 in the winter, 1,200 in the summer. And we had a few buildings that dated back to the 1890s. All those were taken by the fire. But it's mostly made up of like old settler families from the gold rush who went into ranching and mining. And then the Native American tribe, the Maidu, Mountain Maidu, lived there. There's a few Latinx families, of which my family was a part, and a few African American families. But yeah, that's who's up there. A lot of retirees. Median income up there it's like 28,000, mostly retirees. What I like to also tell people about Greenville is we had the distinction of the most PhDs and artists anywhere in the county, and also the most high school dropouts and the lowest incomes. So, so that was us.
That's a broad spectrum, yeah.
So,
let's talk about the fire. On July 13th, 2021, the Dixie Fire broke out and, as we've said, nearly destroyed much of the town of Greenville. How much was destroyed in its path, and how long did it take to put out?
Yeah, so it took out about 800 buildings in the area, 1,329 structures. It's nearly 1 million acres burned, and I know it's hard for anyone to imagine what 1 million acres looks like. It's the largest non-complex fire in California history, and if you can think of it, somebody not too long ago told me like It's if you went from the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and burned everything along the I-80 up to Sacramento, that could give you an idea of how much burned.
Oh
So
my gosh. Like my mouth just dropped.
yeah, so
Massive.
that's a rough comparison, but square footage, that's about the same.
And when
So
you say non-complex fire for our listeners, what does that mean?
a lot of times in fire season, you could have multiple fires. Like if there's a lightning storm, you might have three or four, and they could start burning towards each other. And then that's a complex fire when you had like four mini fires and they became one big fire. But the Dixie Fire is distinctive because it was one giant fire. There's not a bunch of little fires that joined up with this one. This was one giant fire.
And in this, it wasn't just Greenville that was affected, right? There's all these other cities, Indian Falls.
Yeah, it actually took Indian Falls at the end of July. So 2 weeks before Greenville burned, Indian Falls burned. And that was like a community of like 54 houses. There's 9 houses left in that area. And it took,
there's 54 houses, and there's currently 9 houses left.
yeah.
Mm.
And the community of Canyon Dam, which probably had about 50 people who lived there, that whole community's gone. Nothing survived in Canyon Dam at all. And that was right by the lake. So that these are all about, I would say all these towns are about 20 minutes apart driving. But a lot of windy roads. So maybe these are all about 12 to 20 miles apart. And then there was this really cool historic off the grid area called Warner Valley up by Mount Lassen National Park. And it had all these old houses. It was totally off the grid. You could only access it spring to early September. The roads didn't go all the way through in the winter. And that whole place is gone. And they can't rebuild because no one, a lot of it was inherited property and people would come up over the summer. It's not necessarily people of means. It's just people who had these like little shacks up there that their great grandfather had. And none of those can be rebuilt because they're all considered second homes. So no one, there's no way to
Oh,
rebuild
I
them.
didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah. You can only get compensation and help on a home you're actually living in.
Hmm.
So,
Wow. Well, you lived through this, and you're one of the people in Greenville. You live in Los Angeles now. You released a publication, what's called a chap book of poetry called Burn Scars, based on your experience with the Dixie Fire. You will be sharing some of that poetry throughout the show, but first, in a general sense, how did your experience with the Dixie Fire shape this publication and your poetry?
yeah. I mean, for me, I really did struggle with um, everything, thoughts and emotions. And I should backtrack and say that I was a reporter of the area at the same time, and so that was a lot of double duty of reporting on the story and then turning around and being the story, which was very uncomfortable when you're trying to come at it from one angle and then another. And the poetry chapbook just for me was trying to write down things so I wouldn't forget. Um, First of all, and so, and I had a lot of neighbors knew that I write because they've been a reporter in the area for a long time, and so I did have a lot of people emailing me and texting me like, "You're going to write about this, right? You're going to write about this." And I was like, "Yeah, I guess." And I was working on other projects, but I kept like writing a little poem here and there, and then all of a sudden I had 80 poems about fire. And I was like, oh, well, I guess I have a book about fire. And it's for us in the community, it was like we were all just coming out of COVID. My son and daughter were in high school, like trying to deal with the end of that. And then all of a sudden the fire, it really screwed up my daughter's senior year. Um, And I just felt like people outside of Greenville and the neighboring towns, like Quincy, where she went to school and where I worked, like once the fire was out in October, people are like, oh, okay. And just like going back to normal in a way, and not really, kind of being annoyed at people from Greenville who were not, clearly we were all traumatized and weren't bouncing back. you know? And I have to say, every summer somebody somewhere gets evacuated, right? That's a normal thing in Northern California. Is like
It's becoming a normal thing across the United States and the world.
and so we always expect like someone's going to be evacuated somewhere, but this was huge and not something we bounced back from. And I took actually some inspiration from Anna Akhmatova, the Russian poet, because I was reading, so I love her work, and I was reading something in a biography of how she was on a bread line or something, and people came up to her and they were like, "You're that famous poet, are you going to try to describe this before like we're not allowed to describe it anymore?" And all that sort of stuff. So that kind of stuck with and I kept a notebook in the car of things that were like making me angry.
Well, let's share one of those pieces. Your poem "Eulogy for Greenville," I think would be a great place to start, and that's from your publication again called "Burn Scars."
Okay. So, and this speaks to the character of Greenville. My defiantly quirky, beautiful adopted hometown turned into a ghost town last night. There's so many things I could tell you about Greenville. There was over 1,000 people and change, though the population sign still said 2,000. We all have an opinion here about everything. We are a microcosm of America and often frustrated with each other. Greenville is filled with do-gooder volunteers, retirees, hippies, bikers, rednecks, ranchers, cowboys, mountain maidu, and a chunk of people who never felt like the town they were born into someplace else in California was quite the right fit for them. We were extended families and single moms and dads. We were drunks, we were sober, and we tried not to be too judgmental lest someone judge us back. And we were recent survivors from Paradise too. So I'll just stop there, but that should give you a little taste of that. And I end that part on Paradise too, because a lot of people escaping the campfire in 2018 moved to Greenville because it was more affordable. So we had a lot of people in the community who got burned out twice.
And Paradise, for our listeners, was the massive fire that took out the full city of Paradise. Campfire.
Yeah.
Which got a lot of coverage, more so than Greenville. The fire, we talked about this before, but the fire moved very quickly. It burned 963,309 acres across 5 counties in Northern California from July 15th to October 25th. How quickly it took over Greenville is incredibly unbelievable. Can you speak to the day that the day of the fire and how the fire was managed, or maybe not so managed in this case?
Sure. So first thing I'll say is our firefighters did an amazing job of doing everything they could. At the time of the fire, there was at least 53 fires in Northern California. I'm not so sure about the rest of the state. And so it was all hands on deck, and they were understaffed. The whole state was understaffed for fire. But the geography of Greenville was kind of against it. Greenville was known as, or Indian Valley, where Greenville sits, is known as like the most beautiful part of the whole county, and mostly because it has this stark, flat valley floor, and then it goes. There's hardly any incline. There's just these giant, majestic mountains that surround the valley, and unfortunately it was surrounded, right? And so the fire, if you look at a picture of the Dixie Fire, you see it's like this giant dragon of a circle with no escape. So that was really hard. We'd been evacuated for 13 days beforehand, and they'd done a really good job on the dozer lines on the mountains above. So they really thought they could hold it. But unfortunately, we had super high winds that we've never seen a wind like that. And they had flames going up a mile in the air and debris flying everywhere. So the amount of spot fires from it were crazy. And this is a time of drought, and so our reservoirs were low. Water pressure was low. No house that was on city water survived. A lot of houses that did survive were ones that were on their own well and not directly downtown. So yeah, it was over 100 degrees every day from May to July. Sometimes getting up to 110, never getting below 93. And we had no snow that winter. So this is kind of like a perfect climate change storm of factors. You had PG&E's negligence, coupled with the high winds, the drought. And I have to credit our sheriff and supervisor and firefighters because we didn't lose any people. And that is entirely on them that we did.
Amazing. I mean, 8 minutes, the thing blew up in 8 minutes and you lost no people.
Yeah.
That's applaud to them.
Thank
God. Well, we're going to take a break real quick. Listeners, stay tuned because we're going to start the next chapter here, reading a piece of poetry called The War. And so we're going to continue this conversation. We'll also talk about the role that P&G played. So please stay tuned and we'll be right back.